Hi everyone, I'm Cindy Bauer and I am Andy Bauer's sister. For those of you who don't know who Andy is the pastor of Fireside Church along with his wife Kate. And Andy and Kate are not with us today because they're actually in South Carolina celebrating Ellie's birthday. For those of you who don't know our story, Ellie is my niece, my brother's daughter, who passed away a little over a year ago after a 4-year battle with cancer. And so her birthday is a mixture of joy and sorrow for all of us who knew and loved her. And so it seemed like a good idea to get away with the family during this time. And Andy and Kate also have a special place in their heart for the work that I do with children with disabilities in Africa. Andy was a part of it from the very beginning, and I actually met Kate when I was talking about the work that I do at a large church in Maryland. Kate actually grew up in Kenya and came up to me and said she wanted to go on our very first volunteer trip, which just so happened to be being led by my brother, Andy. And the rest is history. So you could fill in the gaps, or they could tell you more about the details of that later. The work that I started about 23 years ago is called Kupenda for the Children. Kupenda for the Children transforms harmful beliefs connected to disability to those that improve the lives of children. And I started it when I was a grad student about 23 years ago and had seen a school that had just started for children with disabilities. And the person who had started this school was my friend, Leonard Imbonani. Well, he's my friend now. At the time, he was a stranger. And he introduced me to about 15 kids who had different kinds of disabilities, who were unable to access the kind of education that they needed, along with physical therapy services and so on. And so I just got some friends and family to pay for some kids to go to school. And that was the beginning. And the reason that I was motivated to do that is that I was told if I had been born in Kenya, that it's very likely that I might have been killed because I was born without my left hand. Because the reason that we exist is that so many people believe that disabilities are caused by superstitious reasons, superstitious beliefs, which include how they're caused as well as how you would intervene for them. Now, I'm going to talk a lot about my experiences in African countries around that, but just know that there are also people who believe in these things here in the United States. It's just not always so prevalent as it is in some of the countries that we work with in Africa. So people with disabilities are often viewed as being caused by witchcraft or demons, or even just having a lack of faith, that they have a disability because of a sin of God. For example, a child with epilepsy might be considered to be demon possessed when they have seizures. I met a boy in Sierra Leone that when he would have a seizure, people would stay away from him completely because they believed that was when the devil was upon him. And unfortunately, this child even believed that about himself when medicine could actually help him in that situation. Now, we don't actually tell people not to pray for healing, that God can't do miracles. He can. But often healing in the sense of a cure is fairly rare. And also, we don't want to say, we're more concerned with when a healing doesn't happen the way we want it to, why people explain it. Because often people will say, if only you had prayed hard enough, or if you had more faith, then you would be healed, putting it on the person instead of God. But if we look in the Bible, we know that there are people that were healed that had no faith at all. And I've heard many stories of people both in African countries as well as in the United States who have been told that the reason that they were sick or the reason that they had a disability was that they just didn't have enough faith. So the very people who needed the love and the support of the church were actually having more suffering piled onto them from the church, when the church is really supposed to be the one that's supporting them. And so in our work, we bring together pastors who will actually talk about, what does the Bible really say about disability? Yes, we know the healing stories, but did you also know that there are people in the Bible who weren't healed, that had disabilities? Did you also know that there were people with no faith that were healed. So I don't know where the idea that having faith was the reason you got healed or not healed. And we talk about what is the church's role as the hands and feet of Jesus. And when we talk about that, the best passage, my favorite passage to really talk about how we can do this as the church is Luke 14, the parable of the great banquet. So if you wanted to look along, if you look at Luke 14, verses 12 through 23, I'm just going to read to you the parable of the great banquet. Then Jesus said to his host, "When you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you'll be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." When one of those at the table with him heard this, he said to Jesus, "Blessed is the one who will eat at the feast of the kingdom of God." And Jesus replied, "A certain man was preparing a great banquet and invited many guests. At the time of the banquet, he sent his servant to tell those who had been invited, 'Come, for everything is now ready.' But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said, 'I have just bought a field, and I must go and see it. Please excuse me.' Another said, 'I have just bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I'm on my way to try them out. Please excuse me.' Still another said, 'I just got married, so I can't come.' The servant came back and reported this to his master. Then the owner of the house became angry and ordered his servant, 'Go out quickly into the streets and alleys of the town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame.' 'Sir,' the servant said, 'what you ordered has been done, but there is still room.' Then the master told his servant, 'Go out to the roads and country lanes and compel them to come in, so that my house will be full. And I tell you, not one of those who were originally invited will get a taste of my banquet.'" And so in this passage, I want you to notice that he's really reflecting on 2 banquets. He's talking about a banquet in heaven and a banquet on earth. And that banquet is really, the one in heaven is heaven. It's the heavenly banquet. And because at those times, the banquet, that's like the big feast. That's when people come together. That's the symbol of community. And I still think today, eating together is a sign of inclusion and a sign of just getting together and communing with people. And then the earthly banquet is that reflection of the heavenly one. He's saying that what's supposed to be happening on earth is the same thing that's happening in heaven. And what is the earthly banquet but the church? The church is a reflection of that heavenly banquet, because it's not just about waiting till we all pass away to see what heaven is, that we get tastes of it here. And I've been lucky enough to be able to get tastes of heaven here on earth, mostly through children with disabilities in African countries and through my experiences walking alongside my niece Ellie as she went through treatments for cancer. And I want you to also understand that there are multiple people represented in this parable. You have the master, which is God. You have the servant, which reflects the church and the people that are part of the church. And I know Andy always will reiterate that the church is more than just Sunday gatherings. The church is a bigger body of people coming together to love Jesus and love others and one another and increase his love for the world. And then we have the people who make excuses, which, again, I think all of these people we can relate to at one time or another. And then finally, we have the people that God specifically said to go out and find. He said people with disabilities. The word crippled isn't really very accepted these days. It's a negative term, but I think at the time when they translated this, that was an acceptable terminology. But he said to go out and find people with disabilities, find people in poverty, find the people that society had rejected. Because you see, at the time of this parable, people with disabilities were not even included in the temple. They were not allowed to come into the temple. And if you look at John 9, you see the disciples asking Jesus about the blind man, saying, who sinned, his father or him, that he was born this way? Making an assumption that, of course, his blindness was because of his sin. And that belief system, again, still seems to pervade in many of the countries we work with, and again, here in the US as well. But the thing that's crazy is Jesus said, go out and find these very people that you believe to be sinful, people you think are bewitched, people that you think are possessed by demons. You get them and you bring them into the church. These are the people that are also going to be coming to heaven too. And the thing that is really interesting is, I think that we can actually be many of these people all at once. We can be those people that feel like we're outcasts, that some of us are disabled, some of us are sick, some of us are poor, some of us are struggling, some of us are just suffering. And we wish someone would come and find us and really embrace us and bring us into the church. And the thing is, that's unfortunate, is a lot of us are also the people who make excuses. The thing that's really interesting is that people here in this passage are not making excuses that are sinful. If you look at this, every excuse they give is basically a blessing. They make an excuse, I've got a job, or I just bought a new house, or I just got married. How often do we do this? We say, oh, I will be more available to serve God, to be fully a part of the church when I retire, or when my job settles down, or when I find a new job, or when I get my house, or when I settle down with the house, or when I finish this particular house project, or when I get married, or when my kids get old enough that they're in school, or when my kids graduate, or when they go off to, where they go off to college, or when I actually get married, that some people think I can't serve because I don't have a spouse yet. But when we say, I'll do it, and then I'll do it. I'll do this, and then. Unfortunately, and thens never seem to come true. We have to do this as the church and be the church in our current circumstances, whatever they might be. So when you think about the church and how we can be more of the church, is how can we go out and find these people and bring them into the church body, the very people that society often rejects. Because when we do that, we get a little more of a glimpse of heaven on earth. And I know for so many of us that have maybe come alongside people, for those of you who have come alongside my niece Ellie, when you've visited in the hospital, when I know this church has also provided meals and laundry services, even built rooms for my niece, you know that when you've done that, you've been blessed as well. And the thing that is just really important about this passage, and is my favorite part of the passage, is he says, go out into the streets and alleys and country roads and find them and bring them in. Because many of the people that are hidden away, they're not going to always tell you their problems. They're not going to say, oh, by the way, I'm suffering. Or they're hidden away. They're feeling shame about their condition. Or maybe they're elderly. Maybe they don't have a way to get to church. But what happens in our work in African countries, when we talk to these pastors about the parable of the great banquet, they literally go into the villages, into the country lanes, into the towns, and find people with disabilities and bring them in to be part of the church. Yes, they'll build ramps as well. They'll make sure that the church is accessible, and that's important. It's good that we would be kind to people when they show up. But this is more active. This is going out and finding them and bringing them here. And these pastors that we work with in Kenya and Sierra Leone and Tanzania and Zambia, they take this passage literally, and they will start parent support groups where families who've never been able to share their stories about their children are actually now able to share and be supported. They're accompanying families to the hospital. They're referring them to schools, and they're including them in the life of the church. And a lot of times they're literally saving the lives of these children. For example, there was a pastor that was part of our workshops in Sierra Leone who, after our workshop, he happened to run into a traditional healer who was about to kill a child with hydrocephalus, which is fluid on the brain. And he stopped him. And keep in mind that this traditional healer and the parents thought they were doing a mercy killing because they thought this child was going to die anyway. There was also that belief around curses and wanting to get rid of that curse. But not only was he able to tell them that this child wasn't cursed, he was also able to refer them to the hospital because we gave them the tools of where to go. And then there's also my friend Zainabou, who is a little girl that was unable to speak or talk, and her mom was told often that it was because of witchcraft that her child was this way. She had cerebral palsy. And Zainabou happened to live in an area that was very rural, very poor in Kenya. And we had done a pastor workshop, I think a traditional healer workshop there as well. And what happened is after that workshop, again, the pastors took it literally. They went out to the streets and alleys and country roads. They shared the message in public forums about disability not being a curse and that the children with disabilities had a right and there were things that they could actually benefit from beyond just supernatural practices. And what happened is they found this group of 25 pastors found 76 families affected by disability and brought these families together. And after sharing their stories, being able to come together and support one another, knowing their rights and all, they realized that there wasn't a school that could actually accommodate the needs of their children. Many of them needed their children to have regular physical therapy, for example, or specialized teaching because some of their children had mobility issues or actually were unable to speak because of their conditions. And so what happened is those same pastors and other community leaders got together and they formed a group that then started a school in the area for these children because there were no schools close to these families that could accommodate their needs. And so they made it happen. And I still think that is something that the church should be as well. And then we have my friend George. My friend George, I knew from very, very early on. He actually spoke at the first Disability Awareness Day we had when Andy and Kate were there as volunteers, and Andy was leading that trip. And George, he walks and he talks, but his talking's a little different because of his cerebral palsy, and his walking is a little different because of his cerebral palsy as well. And he was often told that there was something wrong with him and children didn't want to be friends with him and he was really lonely. And he was treated as if, he wasn't even a human being, like so many people with disabilities have experienced. But it was when one of the pastors, who happens to be our board chair in Kenya, really told him about how God loves him, he loved him, and that he was a human being like anyone else. That George went to school, and George is now in college studying computer technology. But the thing that's super cool that George does now is not only is he a deacon in his church, like a church leader, he's also teaching other pastors now. He is actually our primary speaker when we share with pastors and traditional healers and government officials and so on. He will share his story, a much longer version than what I'm sharing with you right now, and explain to this group of people what his experiences are. And it really humanizes disability because unfortunately, we often think about things like disability or poverty or those things as like an issue as opposed to human beings. And so when George speaks, he's telling them, I am a human being like you, like anybody else. And pastors have reflected on these workshops to us and said that George's testimony was probably one of the most influential parts of the workshop, and that really transformed their mindset around disability and how people with disabilities can be accepted as they are, not just to be changed or to be healed in magical ways. And we love those stories. We have thousands of stories of children who had disabilities that now are in college or married, have this nice, pretty package with a bow, which are our favorite stories sometimes, right? But a lot of times, that's not how the ending is. But it doesn't mean that if that child doesn't go on to succeed in the way we view success, that it's not a success, if you will. There's different kinds. So I have seen more smiles because of the work that we do than many people ever get to see. And that is such a blessing for me to experience that. But I've also, at the same time, done too many eulogies for children, including my own niece. And that's why the story, what happened with my friend Gerald, is a good picture of how even in death, our work is significant. The work of the church is significant in death, and we talk about death all the time. I mean, Jesus, we're talking about heaven. Andy's talked about heaven so much, especially since we've lost Ellie, and Ellie's there now. But my friend Gerald, he has a condition called muscular dystrophy, Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, which for those of you who might not know about it, it's a condition in which no matter where you live, it's fatal. Most people don't live past the age of 25 when they have this condition. And Gerald's family was told that the reason he was gradually getting worse over time was, again, because of witchcraft, is what they were saying. And again, obviously they were sinful. Obviously they weren't having enough faith. Otherwise, Gerald would be getting better instead of worse. But muscular dystrophy, the way it affects a child is the child starts walking, and over time, they lose the ability to walk, they lose the ability to use their hands fully, and eventually their lungs and heart no longer can work the way they need to. But with our work and with the church coming alongside Gerald and his family, we were able to explain to them about the condition he had, come alongside and comfort the family, support him, visit with him. And so it meant that at the end of Gerald's life, which just happened to be about a month before Ellie passed away, Gerald was in the arms of his earthly father as he was lifted into the arms of his heavenly one. And to me, that is success. That is beauty. And those of you who walked alongside us in this church as Ellie was going through treatments, like I said before, you guys, people were built a room for Ellie. People were bringing food and doing laundry and visiting in the hospital and just coming along and supporting my family in amazing ways throughout Ellie's sickness and her treatments. And the church, I know this church knows how to do it. You know how to be the earthly banquet. You know how to be a reflection of heaven, because I saw it. I saw it in the 4 years of Ellie's sickness. And then I saw it in that most horrible last week or two of her life when she was at the end. This church came alongside my family, and in the cold snow of February and COVID happening, people came and were in the garage and in the driveway and singing and praying and pleading for God to heal her, and just being there to comfort the families that they weren't alone as they dealt with something no parent should have to ever deal with. And the way I just envision this is that as Andy and Kate were with Ellie, I picture them almost like straddling this earth and the next and heaven. Like they had one foot on the earth, one foot in heaven. And they're just like accompanying Ellie, supporting Ellie to go there. The thing that is the hardest thing for any person to have to ever go through is to watch your child pass away. But as they were doing it, it's like the whole church was behind them, and they were just supporting them as they supported Ellie. And it's just beautiful. Because no matter what, anyone who's healed eventually dies. Dying is something that's going to happen to all of us. Unfortunately, some of us, it's too soon, and it was too soon for Ellie. But my question I often wonder about is, how many other kids like Ellie, or like George, or Gerald, or Zainabou are there out there? Are there people that are actually suffering alone and in silence? Are there people in this church right now who are dealing with something? I ask you to say something to someone in this church, because this church wants to be there for you. The challenge is we don't always know. And the question is, how can we go out into the streets and alleys and country roads and find the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and bring them in to be part of the church? How can we bring them in to be a reflection of heaven? Because that's what we do when we are more inclusive of the very people that society rejects. How can we do for others what you did for Ellie? How can we do for others what we're doing for these kids in Africa? How can we do it in our own communities? Maybe it's going alongside, like they shared last week, the foster care program and fostering a child. Maybe it's something like getting involved with a local community group and as the church, maybe supporting that. Or maybe it's just you guys sitting around and brainstorming, how can I connect more with my community and find out who are the people that we need to bring in? How can we find them? How can we know who's suffering alone and in silence and needs the love of Christ? And the thing is, that when we go back to the passage of the parable of the great banquet, these people he's talking about were not God's second choice in terms of being invited. It may seem that way, but they weren't. It says they were already invited. They already it had already happened, is what the servant had said. But he also said to get more of them. And I don't think that the reason was because they were second choice, but he knew because they didn't have the same blessings as these people who were making excuses, they were probably going to come, because so many of our kids that we've worked with in African countries have not had someone say a kind word to them, have not had it come from the church. They've only seen the church be negative. They've only seen the church accuse them of something for their condition. They haven't seen the experience of the church being a loving embrace. They haven't seen the church as the arms of Christ. And so when they come, because they don't have the blessings, so many of them that the people making excuses had, they readily come. And for those of you who have gotten a chance to come to Kenya and see these kids' faces, you've seen truly what it says in Matthew 25, that whatever you do for the least of these, you do for me, because you can see Jesus emanating from these children. And I am just lucky enough to be a little bit of a part of that. And you guys are too. And I want to just tell you one more thing that was a blessing for me and not something that usually happens to me. I had this vision several years ago, because the work, like Andy was saying last week, it's really hard, but I promise you it's worth it. But sometimes the hard gets really, really hard, and you're wondering in that moment, can I keep doing this? And I had one of those moments with the work that I was doing. There was a lot of things personally that were happening, and I just didn't know if I could keep doing the work. And I was at a conference around disability in the Bible, and during this conference, they were singing "It Is Well With My Soul." Many of you might know that if you grew up in the church. But during this scripture, during this one verse, it said, "And Lord, haste the day when my faith shall be sight. The clouds be rolled back as a scroll. The trump shall resound and the Lord shall descend, saying, yes, it is well with my soul." And during that time, I don't know what was happening, because I'm a Baptist. We are not into like visions and things. That's just not something that we expect. And so when it happened, I was surprised that my eyes wouldn't open and tears were streaming down my face. And I could see them. I could see the children who had passed before entering the gates of heaven. I could see children getting up out of their wheelchairs and walking in, and the deaf were singing. And it was God's reminder to us that what we're doing here on earth is what's happening in heaven. We're doing the work here. We're getting to see glimpses of what's to come. And sometimes, if you're lucky enough, we get to see a little glimpse of heaven. And over time, I add to that vision. Of course, I picture my dad, who passed about 7 years ago, being welcomed by those kids who are thanking him for the work he did, because he supported me even though initially he had struggled with my disability. Eventually he supported me to be anything I wanted to be, and they knew that because he supported me, that's part of the reason that the work had supported them. And they say thank you, and he's surprised. And I just wonder how many people are going to thank you that you never had any idea that you had such an influence over them. And we recently lost our grandmother a couple months ago, and her as well. She was the one that told my dad, you know, you need to just get with the program. You need to focus on what's going on and support your daughter, and not just focus on this miraculous healing, because again, she knew, as my grandfather did, that God can use things that seem like terrible things for his purposes. And of course, I can't help but picture my niece Ellie. Just over a year ago now that we lost her, and we all miss her every day. But I imagine when she got there, these kids, formerly disabled kids, from Africa that she heard about and loved so much, just telling her stories about her parents, her parents before Ellie was even born, saying, "Hey, I'm here because of your parents," and like telling stories and swapping stories. Because the thing is, that's beautiful, is Andy and Kate ended up finding one another while they were serving children with disabilities. And those very same children with disabilities in the African countries that we work in, we're also praying for them and for Ellie as they dealt with what they were dealing with here. And the thing is, it's important to understand that doing this is not easy, but the blessing is even better than you can imagine. And the story that I had heard at a funeral service of a young man that we lost to muscular dystrophy here in the United States, he was a son of a friend of mine, really exemplifies what this kind of work can look like. He was his caretaker, and this young man had Duchenne's muscular dystrophy like Gerald, and he needed help with just daily living. And this guy who was his caretaker, it was the first time he'd ever come alongside a child, like a young man, like this young man, and hadn't done this work before, and it was just too hard. It's hard to help someone go to the bathroom. It's hard to help someone get dressed and feed them and everything on a daily basis. But what he said at this young man's service just so exemplifies the work. He said, "I never imagined that someone I never wanted to know would be someone I don't want to live without." And I think that you'll see as we make the effort, which seems really, really hard at first, and it might be hard, there are people out there that if we just get over that first step of being uncomfortable, of those inconveniences, of the difficulty of things we're giving up that we don't want to give up, to actually go out and reach out to these people, I think you'll find that if we push through, you're going to be blessed. It is hard, but it is so worth it. And it is something that will resonate both here on earth all the way into eternity. And I know you can do it because I've seen it. And I'm just excited to see how you find more people to be part of the beautiful church that you have here that is a reflection of that church in heaven. Thank you so much.